Okay, good evening and welcome everybody to our second event in this term seminar series at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford. My name is Hanno Brankamp and I'm a departmental lecturer in forced migration here at the Refugee Studies Centre. The theme for this series is race, borders and global immobility. And as I've said in our first session for all of you who were there, the series is a response to the seemingly unending violence that is meted out to life seekers, refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and people on the move more broadly by states and other actors across the world, including stopping migration, detentions, deportations, policing, encampment, imprisonment, interceptions at sea, pushbacks, surveillance, abandonment, and racist immigration policies. Those are just some of the ways in which the mobility of some, and especially those racialized as Black, Brown, and Indigenous, and in particular those from the majority world, is routinely curtailed by those in the minority world, namely the formerly colonizing societies in Europe and North America. So this series is therefore meant to grapple with a wide range of questions arising from these global immobilities, and to address questions of race and racism, coloniality, nationalism, citizenship, belonging, criminalization, and bordering, to name just a few. And once again, I'm absolutely delighted and honored to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Nandita Sharma from the University of Hawaii. And I'm grateful that you accepted my invitation, not least because it's now 8 a.m. in Hawaii, if I'm not wrong. And I think that dedication to speak with us nonetheless deserves a special recognition. Professor Nandita Sharma's talk for today is titled Post-colonial Racisms, National Sovereignty and the Making of New Global Apartheids. And intuitively, I would say that Professor Sharma is one of those people who need no introduction, but as a good host, I will still provide one anyway. Nandita Sharma is professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her extensive and long-standing research addresses questions around human migration, migrant labor, nation-state power, ideologies of racism, sexism, and nationalism, processes of identification and self-understanding, and social movements for justice. Professor Sharma is an activist scholar whose involvement in globally active social movements for justice has shaped both her research agenda and teaching. Professor Sharma is an active member of several social movements, particularly the No Borders movement and those struggling for the planetary commons. To these movements, she brings a feminist, anti-racist approach. And Professor Sharma is also the author of Home Economics, Nationalism, and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, which was published with University of Toronto Press in 2006, and most recently of Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, which was published with Duke University Press in 2020. So I can say that we're all thrilled to have you here today, and we're all excited to learn from your insights. Before I hand over to Professor Sharma, I would like to remind our dear audience that you can submit your questions throughout the talk via the Q&A function. And after the presentation, I will direct those questions to Professor Sharma on your behalf. Okay, over to you, Nandita Sharma.
Thank you so much to Hanno for inviting me to speak from what looks very much like a terrific seminar series. I personally am hoping to attend the rest of the lectures if I can get out of bed so early. And I'd also like to thank all of those whose labor has made this talk possible, and to all of you for attending. So today's talk is going to be based on my 2020 book, Home Rule. And I would like to warn you that there are some disturbing images in my slideshow. We live in a world whose political organization in no way corresponds with the way that we actually live our lives. This is true ecologically. It may be a cliche, but it is plainly evident that the Earth's atmosphere is not divided by national boundaries. Greenhouse gases cause the same degree of global warming, no matter where they are produced. It is also true economically. Living beings are tied to one another through a cycle of capitalist production and consumption, one given force by past and present practices of expropriation and exploitation. It is also true socially, as is evident in this seminar series. So while we cannot live without all of the other beings, without whom our lives would come to a swift end, we have a political system of nation states that divides us politically from one another on the basis of our nationality. We have nation states who claim land and air and water as their sovereign territory, who claim people, other animals, and plants as theirs, who claim to have the exclusive power to determine who enters their national space and under what conditions. Which of the world's nation states one is a citizen of matters. The economist Branko Milanovic has argued that today almost 3/4 of global inequality is due to one's national citizenship. As such, nationals in the rich world nation states are provided with what he terms a citizenship rent. Now, national citizenship matters because nation states across this international systems have the right to limit its obtainment. As Benedict Anderson pointed out, the national organization of society is one in which the political community is always imagined as a limited community. Because no nation encompasses all the world's people, and unlike empires doesn't even want to, immigration and citizenship controls are crucial technologies for nation making and nation maintaining strategies. They are also key technologies for implementing a racist global apartheid, which, like the South African apartheid of the mid to late 20th century, is based on differential citizenship. In my book, Home Rule, I talk specifically about political, economic, and social consequences of nation states' control over human mobility into their territories. I trace the shifts in how states have governed people's mobility as the form of state power has shifted from the imperial form to the national form. This process of nationalizing state sovereignty began fitfully in the 19th century in the Americas, and by the 1960s, the national form of state sovereignty had become dominant. It is at this point that we can say that a new global order emerged, one that I've called the post-colonial New World Order. In this new system of governance, people across the world are defined as members of separated nations and ruled through the combined apparatuses of nation-state sovereignty, international bodies, and the global circulation of capital. Established at the end of World War II, post-colonialism marks the end of the political legitimacy of imperial state sovereignty and the beginning of the hegemony of national forms of state sovereignty. After World War II, with astonishing speed, the near global space of imperial states was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from empires. In the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states entering World War II, the British and the French, lost the vast majority of their empires and nationalized the sovereignty of their imperial metropoles. Each marked their newfound national sovereignty by implementing citizenship and immigration controls. For those colonized people who did not obtain national sovereignty, the demand for it nevertheless defines their struggles. For many who have been identified as Hawaiians or Mohawks, Armenians or Kurds, Palestinians or Kashmiris, their struggles are often framed as struggles for national liberation. It is thus clear that in the post-colonial New World Order, being a member of a nation in possession of territorial sovereignty is the thing to become. Only by organizing as a nation can claims to power in this system be heard. This is not an accident. While much attention is paid to the dominant part played by the United States in this new global governance system, what is often ignored is how critical the United States was to its emergence. Having nationalized its own state sovereignty starting in 1875, a full 100 years after independence, with the passing of its first immigration controls, the 1875 Page Act, the United States played a pivotal role in ending empires and establishing the global rule of nation states. Shortly before the end of World War II, the United States insisted that the doctrine of national self-determination become the basis for a restructured global capitalist economy, one which it hoped to dominate. We know that after World War I, the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule had been enshrined in the League of Nations. At that time, however, this doctrine did not apply to people in the colonies of imperial states. Empires had been willing to reimagine their metropoles as national societies for some time, but they well knew that extending such a status to their colonies would result in the collapse of imperial rule. By 1941, however, with metropolitan France under Nazi occupation and the British metropole under siege, Britain was desperate for United States help in fighting the Axis powers. The United States seized the opportunity to demand a reorganization of the still largely imperial world to its advantage. That year, President Roosevelt succeeded in having British Prime Minister Churchill accept the extension of the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule to the natives in its colonies. Their agreement was sealed in the 1941 Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was, of course, far from an expression of solidarity with the colonized on the part of the United States. The United States could not have been less interested in giving up expropriated land, including the lands comprising US national territory, or in ending the exploitation of people's labor power. Neither would the United States countenance the creation of a world without hierarchies of worth and disparities in wealth, power, and peace. Instead, the United States understood that imperial state monopolies over their colonies prevented capitalists based in the United States from exploiting these same territories and the people in them. Empires simply stood in the way of the United States becoming a world hegemon. The basis of US support for expanding the principle of national self-determination to the colonies was the understanding that it would gain from the opening of closed imperial markets for land, labor, and commodities. Such an opening would be achieved by the transformation of both imperial metropoles and colonies into independent sovereign nation states, each enmeshed in an international regime of financial, political, and military ties. The United States was, of course, wildly successful in achieving its goals. The universal principle of self-rule agreed to in the 1941 Atlantic Charter formed the basis for the first major international political institution of post-colonialism, the United Nations. In its 1945 founding charter, the United Nations enshrined the recognition of the right of national self-determination, or the right to national sovereignty for those people who could successfully claim to being the people of a place, as the bedrock of international law. Hostility to migrants was bred in the bone of the United Nations Charter. With its declaration of the rights of nations to self-determination, it would not, nor could it, account for the rights of all those people who were not the people of the nation, i.e., those who were people out of place. The United Nations Charter thus stood in stark contrast to how many people actually lived, and certainly in stark contrast to the reality of the immediate post-World War II experience of mass migration in Europe and Asia. Contra to the rhetoric of national liberation or the bromides of the United Nations, this world of nation states did not represent a challenge to the social relations of imperialism. Instead, post-colonialism worked to contain the revolutionary and liberatory demands of people to abolish the practices of expropriation and exploitation most closely associated with colonization. Indeed, the new international system provided the institutional structures and the legitimized force of coercive state action for capitalist social relations to expand, which they did to a scale and scope previously unimagined. This expansion of capitalism occurred through, not against, the nationalization of states, sovereignty, territory, and subjectivities. Claiming to have liberated people, post-colonialism liberated capital instead. The post-colonial New World Order is thus not only a particular historical period, the post-World War II era, or the body of scholarship trying to understand it. Post-colonialism is the governmentality of the international system of nation states and the equally international system of capitalist social relations. One poignantly captured by this proverb: when the axe came into the woods, many of the trees said, "At least the handle is one of ours," or us. While post-colonialism clearly does not work for most of the world's people, the largely melancholic response to the grossly unequal social relations of post-colonialism sustains it. Today, people are far more likely to talk about imperialism or neo-colonialism than they are to take a cold, hard look at the work of nation states and of the nationalisms of all stripes. Support for nationalism and for nation states remain hegemonic across the political spectrum, as national sovereignty continues to be seen as the last bastion of resistance against foreign incursions. As new nations and new nation states form, while older ones dissolve, new national liberation movements arise to remake the borders of nationalized territory and set different limits for membership in the nation. National citizenship and immigration controls are together the key technologies for the material and cultural realization of post-colonial biopower. National citizenship and immigration regimes represent the institutionalization of what I am calling post-colonial racism, wherein racialized discourses are reformulated in discourses about nationality. Documents that mark one's nationality are today's crucial technologies of racism. Separating nationals from migrants is the leitmotif of post-colonial rule, and its power is far from spent. In fact, the post-colonial politics of separation between nationals and migrants are hardening and expanding in ever more uncanny ways. In this regard, the politics of autochthony are critical to the normalization of post-colonial racisms. What is autochthony? Derived from the Greek autos, or self, and katon, or earth, an autochthon was one, originally in the plural, who had literally sprung from the earth. The term referred to, quote, an original or indigenous inhabitant of a place, according to the OED. The term indigenous is also from classical Greece. To be indigenous was to be, quote, born inside, with the class connotation of being born inside the house, the master's house. Like autochthon, indigenous denoted someone or something, quote, born or produced naturally in a land or region, native or belonging naturally to the soil, region, etc., again, according to the OED. The counterpart to autochthonous or indigenous people were people categorized as allochthons, predicated on the Greek allo, referring to that which is other or different, and the Indo-European allo, referring to someone or something else, and used initially as a geological reference. Allochthonous referred to something originating or formed in a place other than where found, according to the OED. It was not until the period of indirect rule colonialism, starting in the mid-19th century, that things and later people were defined as allochthons. I'm sorry I can't get into that historical process more here, but I do discuss it extensively in Home Rule. Today, autochthonous discourses restrict political membership to those who can show they are native to the national polity. Even though the imperial state category of native, which marked the status of colonized subjects, was thought to have disappeared as colonized natives became independent nationals, it becomes clear that embedded in each idea of national sovereignty or home rule is the notion that true nationals are those who are native to its territory. These are whom I'm calling the national natives. An autochthonous worldview presents the world as if each nation has its own place in the world. The idea of a world composed of distinct and seemingly equivalent nationalities is what allows nation states to effect racist exclusions without naming race. Political membership in nations predicated on autochthony thus manifest racialized ideas of essentialist origins in territorialized form. This is the core of what post-colonial racism is. By restricting the making of claims to sovereignty, territory, and rights to those who are national natives, discourses of autochthony produce borders even more fortified and difficult to cross than those between national and migrant. While it is conceivable that one could become a national citizen, it is nearly impossible to become a national native. This shift in racist technologies was a response to the success of post-World War II efforts to delegitimize the racisms which fueled fascist politics. From the 1950s onward, racism became increasingly unacceptable in mainstream politics. Academics wrote landmark reports, including for UNESCO, which showed that race was socially and historically constructed and in no way reflected actual differences between human beings. Those continuing to declare themselves racists were regarded as extremists. Concomitantly, the popular understanding of what constituted racism associated it only with extreme acts of denigration and or violence. Yet at the same time, this post-World War II period, state sovereignty was near universally nationalized. Practices of exclusion or differential inclusion grounded in nationalism was regarded not only as legitimate, but as a requirement in politics. Borrowing from recent history of racializing nationality, the impossibility of national belonging for those seen as out of place became just an everyday part of nation-state power. Since the 1980s, across the world system of nation-states, a further contraction of the already limited criteria of national belonging has taken place around the figure of the national native. At the same time, an expansion of the term colonizer has occurred, one that encompasses all those seen to be migrants. Borrowing the imperial meaning of natives as colonized people, national natives see themselves as colonized by migrants. In turn, migrants' own experience of colonization is seen as unimportant and unpolitical. Instead, migrants are demonized as destroyers of nations. Today, national autochthony is increasingly important to nationalist projects, both from above and from below. Placing people into separated categories of national natives and migrants is no trifling matter. Their legal and or social separation animates deadly conflicts around the world. A particularly stark example of this is taking place in the National Liberation State of Myanmar, formerly Burma, where the separation of national natives and migrants is the basis of one of the world's most recent genocides, this time against the Rohingya people. Nation-state officials and popular Buddhist monks categorize mostly Muslim Rohingya as quote unquote illegal Bengali migrants and argue that expelling them from both the nation and its sovereign territory is necessary for the defense of national society and the defense of its indigenous people. Having been socially constituted as migrants, many Rohingya have been made migrants in the law by having had their Myanmar citizenship taken from them and or having been forced to flee Myanmar. There are many other stark examples in what have been termed the national liberation states. For example, the deadly conflicts between supposed natives and supposed migrants in Darfur and Rwanda. We also have the Yugoslav wars, the military coup d'etats of Asian parliamentary leaders in Fiji in the 1980s into the 2000s, and the expulsion of Asians from Uganda in 1972. We have moral panics over migrant invasions in Europe, which have spurred violence and provided the political foundations for a growing authoritarianism. In the former British white settler colonies, the distinction between settlers and immigrants is collapsing. In indigenous national movements, every non-native is increasingly regarded as a settler colonist, including those groups who were expressly excluded from the white settler colonial project: Black people, Latinx people, and Asian people, all of whom can now be depicted as colonizers of indigenous national natives by virtue of their presence on native territory. In the process, the very act of moving is made into an act of colonization, further shoring up the autochthonous worldview wherein every people has their place and mobility can only ever be understood as an invasion of alien species. Such a hardening of nationalisms is at the same time an intensification of post-colonial racisms. While these many different instances of autochthonous nationalisms are not equivalent to one another, white supremacists are not the same as Buddhist monks advocating genocide in Burma, neither are they the same as indigenous people in the United States or Australia, arguing that the descendants of slaves and indentured workers are colonizers. However, there are important similarities in the different uses of autochthonous discourses, and these are not merely semantic. Autochthonous discourses, like all racist discourses, rely on the portrayal of nativeness as an essential, unpolitical characteristic of some specified group of people, a characteristic that sets them apart from all others. In this sense, autochthonous discourses are relational. They produce some people as migrants as the negative others of national natives. The deployment of autochthonous discourses, thus reveals a crucial feature of post-colonial power. All nationalisms are fundamentally autochthonous and productive of a post-colonial racism that organizes a hierarchical separation between national natives or autochtons and migrants or alloctons. Across the world and across the political spectrum from far right to left, the prerogative of national natives is the right to home rule. In the process, migrants are left without a home in this world. This brings me to my final point, decolonization. To start or to end, we must recognize that the terms of decolonization have been co-opted. The fact that the very practices denounced by anti-colonial movements as imperialist, the expropriation of land, the exploitation of labor, the oppression of the colonized, the fact that each of these continues unimpeded in every nationally sovereign state is the truth that is rarely spoken to post-colonial power. The continuing significance of movements for national self-determination, both in extant nation states and in movements for new national sovereigns, has left us with an understanding of colonialism as nothing more than foreign rule. Consequently, decolonization has become nothing more than home rule, the elevation of national natives over migrants. This has worked to contain anti-colonial demands by allowing nationalists to make the case that the reason national sovereignty has not yet delivered what it promised is the existence of foreigners in the nation's territories. The result has been a hardening of nationalisms and a resultant increase in anti-immigrant politics. Indeed, anti-colonialism has largely been remodeled as anti-immigration, and contenders for political power in rich and poor world nation states alike bemoan their lack of national independence. Yet it is abundantly clear that the nation state, any nation state, is wholly incapable of delivering on the promises of anti-colonialism. This is not because it doesn't have enough national sovereignty, as theorists of neocolonialism argue, but because of the global arena in which capitalism operates and because of the relationship between ruling classes and state power. This is glaringly so with regard to national citizenship and immigration controls, which have from the start been a response to crises in capitalism. The subordinate state categories that a growing number of people on the move are placed in, categories such as temporary foreign worker or illegal, sometimes couched in the new law and order category of victims of trafficking, have done two main things: provide flexible and relatively cheaper labor power, and politically separate workers from one another within what is obviously a world market for labor power. Anti-immigrant politics only create more competition within labor markets nationalized through citizenship and immigration controls. More nationalism leads to more anti-immigration politics, which leads to the further cheapening of those people classified as migrants, which leads to more competition, which leads to more nationalism, which leads to more competition and more cheapened migrant labor ad infinitum. While portrayed as benefiting citizens by elevating them above migrants, in reality, citizenship and immigration controls are a form of enclosure that harms all workers. To acknowledge this is to acknowledge the failure of nation states. To avoid addressing this reality, nation states endlessly replay the fight against colonialism, for this positions them as the defenders of the nation rather than the managers of ruling relations. This is why new colonizers have to constantly be produced, and why migrants, the quintessential people out of place, can be represented as settler colonists invading native nations. The existence of new colonizers normalizes national native sovereignty. We can renew our commitment to decolonization by calling for the death of the National Liberation Project. Rejecting racist, nationalist ideas of a territorialized self is a critical step in undoing post-colonial racism. So to conclude, to move from our present of social, economic, political, and climate catastrophe, we need to transform our relationships to one another and to our shared planet. It needs to be truly shared in order to survive. No other set of relationships other than that provided by the commons is capable, I would argue, of creating the situation wherein one small group of human beings do not succeed in forcing us all into the necropolis. A world in common is a world without borders and boundaries that establish differential value and worth of living beings. And I will conclude there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much. That was really, really rich and insightful. And thank you so much, Professor Nandita Sharma, and thank you, everyone.